So I'll ask the panelists to come join us for the next panel. And it's my pleasure to introduce Diane Coyle. So they'll filter in whilst I'm introducing Diane. Again, she's another speaker who will be very well known to most of our audience. She's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and she co-directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads research on the themes of progress and productivity. Her latest book, which I'm sure she'll be happy for us to mention, is Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be. It's really trying to focus on the future of economics, so very germane to today's topic. She's had a whole number of public roles, many of which you'll heard of, but I'll particularly call out her sitting on the panel that has become colloquial known as the Furman Report, and she was one of the 5 experts on that. So over to you, Diane. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody in the room and online. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. I've actually been looking at the digital economy for the past 25 years, and so it's been great for me that, as Benoît Cœuré pointed out in the previous session, the whole economy is the digital economy now. It's been fantastic. Particularly recently looking at data and the use of data by companies. So data is an economic asset of growing importance, and the recent research by economists underlines the productivity and profit benefits of using data effectively, which is helping frontier firms pull ever further ahead of their competitors. So as a productivity story, that's great for those companies, but there seem to be 2 costs associated with it. One is the increased concentration, and the other is the potential privacy costs, and obviously there's been a lot of debate about privacy. So privacy and competition, the theme of this panel. And not so long ago, these seemed like 2 unrelated areas of policy. And they've converged in a way that raises lots of non-obvious questions. So to what extent are the policy aims in harmony or in conflict? Is the source of the problem that we are concerned about existing business models and therefore data practices of incumbent tech companies? Does that mean, if so, that antitrust is the right policy tool? And there have been proposals from the competition world, such as open data. Alternatively, is different and tougher ex-ante regulation the right solution to whatever we think the problem is? Or on the other hand, is improved privacy protection a feature of competition in the market? So we can rely on that. To what extent should we rely on informed consumer choice? Should individuals actually have to bear the burden of their own privacy protection, or is that just part of the time tax of modern online life? So to dig into these questions, we've got a fantastic panel. And I'm going in the order that was in the email that was sent to me a while ago, so it's probably entirely random as far as the panel is concerned. But we're going to start with John Edwards as the Information Commissioner for the UK. And so I'm going to ask the panel members to tackle whichever of those questions they fancy, and I might follow up with some of my own, and then we'll have time for the audience questions online later. So John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thanks to Andrea and the CMA for hosting this event. It's wonderful, and to be on such an auspicious panel, such a talented people is really amazing. It's going to illuminate this topic, I think. We've heard already an incredible level of sophisticated economic analysis and discourse and really deep technological understanding. And I want to tell you that ends now. I have been reflecting a little bit on this marketplace and how these regulatory roles come together. Just a couple of weeks ago, the streets of London were resonating with the music of Queen as Queen performed in front of Buckingham Palace. I don't think they performed one of their most renowned numbers, which they gave to the soundtrack of a famous 1980s movie, Highlander. Anybody seen that film? Yes. So Highlander is a story of a bunch of immortals roaming the world, lopping each other's heads off until, as Sean Connery says in one scene, in the end, there can be only one. Now this became the business model of digital startups. And was dubbed, in fact, the Highlander Principle in about 2009. There can be only one audio streaming service. There can be only one social media platform. There can be only one ride share, one accommodation share, right? Which has led, I think, to these extraordinarily dominant digital businesses. Now, my previous job, I was Privacy Commissioner in New Zealand, a nation of 5 million. We were takers of these technologies. And the problem there emerged quite quickly for me is that they are one and we are many. And in my initial thinking around this issue, the we was we, privacy commissioners, data protection regulators around the world. We're just nipping at the heels, and we need, if we're going to be effective, to join together and to cooperate. And more we're seeing that happen. And I'm really pleased with the work that we are doing with colleagues in Singapore. I had a meeting today about the artificial intelligence audit tool that they have developed with the Federal Trade Commission. We've done a Clearview AI investigation with the Privacy Commissioner in Australia, for example. But the they are one and we are many problem, it seemed to me quite quickly, is not just we are many around the world, it's that we are many domestically. There are many different regulators regulating different parts of the elephant, if you like. And there are opportunities for the market participants to play one off against the other to the detriment of the consumer public. And it seemed to me that, back at home, we need to be coordinating with content regulators, with privacy regulators, with competition regulators. So imagine my great joy and surprise when I arrived here in the United Kingdom to find that not only was this thinking more developed, it had actually materialized into an entity called the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum. And that is so important, I think, in resolving some of the questions that have come up today, that we can present a united front and a united modus operandi. We can join the dots in the different disparate regulatory models to get good outcomes for consumers. It's not without risks, but it's really essential that we walk really closely together so that we can, for example, examine some of the claims that industry can't do this competition outcome because it might prejudice this data protection imperative, or vice versa. We've seen, I think, some really positive developments in data protection through the likes of Apple's ad tracking transparency and Google's retirement of the third-party sandbox. But those are really positive consumer outcomes from a privacy perspective that could be looked at from a competition lens as perhaps self-preferencing. And the merit, I think the benefit of working so closely together as regulators is that we can ensure if there is self-preferencing or if those issues do need to be examined, that they are examined without prejudicing those positive privacy outcomes for the consumer public. Similarly, I suspect Jane might talk about the interoperability imperative that's being driven from Europe, because it was a big issue in DC a month or two ago when we were there. That the security framework from some of the closed platforms is a really important feature for privacy outcomes, as with end-to-end encryption. And if you drive interoperability in a way that compromises those positive outcomes, then that has a net deficit for consumer safety. So we need to be able to examine those claims and to do that in a way which is coordinated and joined up. So I'll just pause there, and there are many other examples, I think, and lots more potential for us to work together. But there's a saying from back home in the Maori language, which I will embarrass myself by having to read, but it's a whakatoi, which is a proverb, and it is "Nā tō roro, nā taku roro, ka ora ai te iwi." And this is often used when tribes come together. And they say, with your food basket and my food basket, all the people will thrive. And I think it's a nice way of encapsulating the imperative and the benefits of close cooperation between regulators to achieve common goals for consumers in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Before I turn to Jane, can I just follow up and ask you to say a little bit more about international cooperation, because it's hard enough among domestic regulators. How do you see it working across borders?
It is a challenge, but it's increasingly being seen as an imperative. I mean, there are a number of cooperation frameworks. The Global Privacy Assembly has an international enforcement cooperation mechanism. The APEC has an enforcement cooperation network as well. There are many bilateral opportunities for enforcement, and we see those. We've seen those with WhatsApp with Ireland and Canada. We've seen Canada cooperating with Australia. So we are seeing those networks develop more and more. There are limitations, and the domestic, each of us operates within a domestic framework. So I do think some of these conversations need to be elevated to state level in order to provide a more timely and seamless regulatory environment.
Yeah, and I think Timu's closing point about political consent is really important in that regard as well. Let's move on. There'll be other questions later. We'll go to Jane next. Jane Horvath is Apple's Chief Privacy Officer. And Jane, I think you're going to talk about how you see competition on privacy working and how it benefits consumers.
Sure. Thanks, Diane. And I want to thank the CMA for inviting me to speak to you all today. The discussion of privacy in the context of competition is necessary, and it is critical that we get it right. At Apple, we believe privacy is a fundamental human right, which is why we design every product and feature from the ground up with privacy in mind. While privacy is a competitive differentiator, it is not the reason why we build privacy into everything that we do. We do it for our customers and because it's the right thing to do. Our teams work collaboratively across Apple, putting the same effort into privacy innovation as we put into all of our product designs. And the result is greater choice and superior products for our customers. And at Apple, privacy is truly a company-wide commitment, and no single person or team is solely responsible for bringing it to life. Rather, at Apple, privacy is a cross-functional pursuit. This is true in everything that we do, but let me give you an example. One day, 2 engineers showed up at my door, and they were just standing there, and I said, "Hi, can I help you?" And this was about 8 years ago. And they said, "We are going to be creating a wearable. And we think that there's a lot of potential with this wearable for health information and health innovation. And we want to get it right. And we're just at the beginning, and we want to make sure that your team is embedded in that product from the beginning." And that product ended up becoming Apple Watch. And as we were looking at building Apple Watch and the health app, we were also looking about the potential innovation that can come from health data. So as we were looking at the guidelines that would guide app developers that wanted to call and work with this health data, we looked at it from how do we protect the consumers here, because this is very sensitive information, but give apps the ability to use this data. So in the App Store guidelines, if a developer wants to call the APIs for health data, they have to do so solely for the purposes of health and fitness. No secondary uses there, because that is the most privacy-friendly way. That is privacy by default. The same approach applies to advertising in our ecosystem. Back in 2011, when I joined Apple, developers were using a UDID, and had been since 2007. The UDID was a hardware identifier which they used to track users across the platform and to serve ads. A UDID offers users no choice as it is hard-coded into the device, and it was bad for privacy. Recognizing the role that advertising plays in supporting a vibrant app ecosystem, we set out to design a more privacy-friendly approach. In examining the ecosystem, we determined that there were 3 identifiers that were necessary for effective advertising. 2 identifiers, the app identifier and the vendor identifier, could be used for first-party advertising in the app or vendor ecosystem, respectively. The third, the IDFA, or identifier for advertising, was designed to allow apps to do third-party advertising. Each app on your device can call the same IDFA. The IDFA is used for tracking. I'm so sorry, I've got something in my throat. In 2012, we launched those 3 identifiers and also included a limit ad tracking, or LAT switch. in which users could ask apps not to track. By 2013, we recognized that apps were not abiding by this policy prompt, so we moved it to a technical control in which the lat switch reset the IDFA. Again, we recognized this was not enough privacy protection, so in 2016, the lat switch changed to technically reset the IDFA to all zeros. However, we continue to hear from our customers. A good example of this is, dear Apple, is my phone listening to me? I was recently talking to my husband about a shoe that I'd looked at online and that I, would want for a potential birthday gift. And suddenly that shoe is appearing on every app on my device. Surely the phone must be listening to me. No, in fact, what was happening was she probably looked at the shoe on an app, and then that developer transferred that data to a third-party ad network, and those placements were made across other apps. And that is what we call tracking. So in 2021, we launched App Tracking Transparency, or ATT. ATT is not anti-advertising. It just puts consumers in control of whether they are tracked or not. Any app that wants to track must call the ATT prompt, and only after that person agrees will the app be able to call the IDFA or to track. It is important to note that ATT does not impact first-party advertising. All apps may still freely do first-party advertising. Apple engages in limited advertising on our platform, but we do not track, and we go further than our competitors. Apple does not use third-party data for advertising on its own apps. Apple actively prompts users to choose whether Apple can use first-party data to serve them personalized ads. No other first-party ad network does that. Even when serving personalized ads on its own apps, Apple does not allow for targeting of groups smaller than 5,000 users. Lost in the conversation about privacy's impact on the bottom line of advertisers and data brokers is the user. This is who we should be thinking of first, and that is how Apple approaches privacy. At Apple, we reject the idea that our users and their personal data are products for us to sell, but that view is exceedingly rare among other technology companies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. Water to sit there. So obviously for Apple, privacy is a dimension of competition. It's part of the effective competition. But you'll be aware that many people say, no, it's what Apple has done is protecting the position of a powerful incumbent. So what's the kind of evidence that competition authorities should be looking at to weigh up those competing views?
Sure. The App Store. In order for a developer to get on the App Store, a developer has to register. They have to agree to the App Store guidelines. I referred to those when I was talking about health and the additional privacy requirements in the guidelines. And they have to submit their app for app review. App review will first and foremost run the app to make sure that it actually runs and it does what it says it's supposed to do. So a while back, there were a number of flashlight apps, and App Review detected that those flashlight apps were calling a lot of APIs that they really didn't, why does a flashlight app need your location? So App Review goes through and determines, are they minimizing the data that they need to operate? So App Review also is able to weed out malware. And this is the data point that I think is very, very critical. The other competing platform does allow other apps to come onto the platform through what we call sideloading. But that platform has 98% more malware than iOS does. And that's a public number out there. So what I would just caution as we look at opening up the platform, we also have to make sure that we're not exposing consumers who have really gotten used to operating on a relatively safe platform to expose themselves to these kind of attacks. And then the other, and John referred to it, is as we look at interoperability, I know there was a question asked of Tim Wu, we also one of the requirements is interoperability of even end-to-end encrypted systems. That is a risky endeavor. There are some, but much more limited people who think it's possible, but most think that that will come with some loss of security.
Thanks very much. We're going to turn now to Jonathan, the computer scientist on the panel, Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton. And you're going to talk to us about some of these technical questions, I think, Jonathan, so far away.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane, and thank you to the CMA for convening so many global leaders in competition policy, present self-excluded, of course. So I'd like to do my part to kick off the panel discussion with the most academic of methods, a conceptual taxonomy. So I want to suggest 7 ways in which privacy and competition are deeply intertwined. The first is that privacy problems can contribute to competition problems. So an example is in the search engine market, where Google search processes a large volume of user search data, and that may be a barrier to new market entrants. Or in the e-commerce market, Amazon has allegedly used its large store of customer data for competitive advantage in entering retail verticals. A second way in which competition and privacy can interact is that competition problems can contribute to privacy problems. So an example there is in the social network market. Facebook, or I guess Meta as the cool kids call it now, is arguably a dominant incumbent, and that allows it to more comprehensively collect and leverage user data on its services. Or another example, again, the search engine market, the web browser market. Google Chrome has a very significant market share, and that allows it to set de facto privacy norms on the web. A third way in which these two areas can interact is that privacy remedies can overlap with competition remedies. So data portability, transfer, and interoperability advance both privacy and competition goals. Query how effective they are or could be. A fourth way in which privacy and competition interact is that competition remedies can create privacy problems. So, for example, interoperability proposals have led to concerns about end-to-end encryption, as Jane just noted, and alternative app stores and side-loaded apps have led to concerns about protecting user data, also, as Jane noted. A fifth way in which privacy and competition can interact is that privacy remedies can create or exacerbate competition problems. So an example there is in the display advertising market. Google recently proposed a topics API, which could potentially entrench Google as a dominant firm because of the technical design of the API, where it rewards reach across the web and having access to other sources of browsing data. Another example is comprehensive privacy regulation, like GDPR, where some critics have been concerned that it may disproportionately be burdensome for market entrants and disproportionately be easier to comply with for large incumbents. The sixth way in which privacy and competition might interact is that choice architecture problems, often termed dark patterns, pervade both privacy and competition policy. Ultimately, if there's a willing consumer who consents to a particular data flow or a particular transaction, law pretty rarely stands in the way of that. And so that leads to immense problems about the structure of user choices. In privacy, examples include cookie consent banners with asymmetric choices, or buried account privacy settings that are rarely understood by users, or sometimes even a company's own employees. On the positive side, Apple's app tracking transparency. And in the competition landscape, examples include defaults and self-preferencing. Okay, the last area I want to touch on is how new privacy models, especially on the open web, can enable platform oversight and accountability. And that includes for competition problems. So traditional research methods for understanding online services like interviews and surveys and web crawls are really essential for scrutinizing platforms. But those methods also have some very significant limitations. Interviews and surveys rely on self-reported recollections, for example, and web crawls might not be reflective of real user activity. Understanding what users actually experience with online services and the actions they take in the context of those services is especially important for the large platforms because they're so individualized. That's through content personalization, ad targeting, and a user's own decisions about what queries to run or who to follow on a social network. There are some important legislative initiatives moving forward, like the DSA in Europe, that are a promising path toward researcher access to platform data, though of unclear scope of access and of timeline at present. So new privacy models are an important complement. If users can contribute their data for platform accountability purposes to academic research groups or to trusted nonprofits, that will enable new quantitative insights about the effects of specific business practices and the efficacy of specific market interventions. So one example of this is the Markup Citizen browser, which studies Facebook recommendations by sourcing data from real Facebook users. Another is NYU's Ad Observatory, which collects Facebook ads. And where I'll leave things is a pair of projects that my group at Princeton has been developing for a little over 2 years called Rally and Web Science. And the idea is to democratize this kind of platform accountability research. These tools, which we've been developing with Mozilla, are already in use by teams at the Markup in Stanford and Columbia, and they're being used to understand issues like information integrity and competition and privacy. And we can answer questions like, what are the effects of a specific platform self-preferencing practice? How would users respond if regulation prohibited a specific practice? What are the effects of a certain default? What are the effects of choice ballot remedies, which the EU has used in some instances? So we can answer very specific competition policy questions with rigorous quantitative research. And I think that's ultimately what's most exciting about this direction, that we can use these new privacy models for platform accountability to advance data-driven competition policy. And legislators and regulators like the CMA will be equipped with better evidence about the market effects of anti-competitive practices and can better predict how interventions they might require would improve those practices. Thank you.
That's fascinating. You talked about academics using these tools. What do you want competition authorities like the CMA to do?
For starters, events like these and the ability to engage one-on-one are really invaluable. I think in the near term, it is probably unrealistic for competition authorities to run this particular type of study themselves. Involves handling data from individual users, and putting government agencies in that position brings with it a whole bunch of considerations that are different from academics conducting that kind of study. So I think academics feeding into government agencies with this type of research is important. I also think there are kinds of studies that don't have the privacy sensitivities that this kind of study does. So you could imagine, for example, regulators using web crawls or more ordinary and widely accepted survey methods that pair up nicely with these methods that involve sourcing data about online activity directly from users.
The questions are flooding in, so please keep them coming. But our final speaker is going to be Damien Geradin of Geradin Partners, talking about the app developers and the implementation of privacy measures on them. So Damien, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, Diane, and thank you to the CMA and in particular Stefan for putting together this great conference. As you alluded to, in the interest of full disclosure, I represent a number of app developers, some of which have issues with Apple and Google. I would like to focus my short presentation on the tension between, on the one hand, the need for platform operators to adopt and enforce rules to ensure the quality of their platform, and on the other hand, the risk that these rules and enforcement are used by the platforms to engage in self-preferencing and other distortions of competition. This tension is addressed in the recently issued final report of the CMA's market study on mobile ecosystems, which is, by the way, an excellent piece of work. I really commend the CMA for drafting it. And it also shows that if you have the right team and the right skills, you can do a lot in 1 year. Very often it's said that competition authorities are very slow. In this case, I'm impressed by what they managed to do in a single year. While this tension can be found with respect to all digital platforms, I will, however, focus essentially on mobile ecosystems because this allows me actually to draw from the market study of the CMA. This panel focuses on privacy, but I would like also to include security because very often privacy and security are arguments that are made together in order to justify the status quo and resist regulatory intervention even when needed. I think this topic is particularly well suited to this event because this relationship between privacy and security arguments on the one hand and pro-competitive intervention on the other hand requires evidence-based, data-driven decision-making by regulators. So I'm sorry I'm going to pick a little on Apple, even though my neighbor is actually working for Apple. But Apple is very much actually the focus of this market study when it comes to privacy and security as justifications for the status quo. In the context of the market study, the CMA accepts that platform governance is essential and brings benefits for consumers. That's actually true. If you're a platform, you need to protect the quality of the platform. You need to have rules and enforce the rules, because if your platform is infested by scammers, consumers will actually leave the platform. So you need to have rules and enforce them. At the same time, the CMA rightly stresses there are clear risks that this rule setting and oversight role oversteps the mark. And I will cite one bit of the market study which says, where private companies such as Apple and Google adopt a quasi-regulatory role, for example in relation to data protection law, there are risks that these companies face conflict of interest, as their own profit-driven incentives may not always be fully aligned with those of their users. I think that's an important point. So I think that one of the great value of the market study is that it relies on technical evidence and technical expertise. A report was commissioned from a tech consultancy. There was also expert advice from a university professor. I think this is really what you want to do. I think that the market study repudiates the narrative, which I'm afraid is often pushed by Apple, whereby there is a binary choice and an avoidable trade-off between enabling greater competition and protecting user privacy, security, and safety. My view is that these are not mutually exclusive objectives. And the evidence is in the CMA report clearly shows it is possible to increase competition while preserving user privacy, security, and safety. I often hear that privacy is a human right. It is, and it is very important, but the right to property is also a human right, but it doesn't mean that you can use your property to distort competition. I think that these rights must be and are actually compatible with a competitive market framework. So if you look at the market study, it is quite skeptical about the privacy and security arguments Apple has raised to justify restrictions in app distribution, restrictions in browser engines, restrictions in cloud gaming, and restrictions in accessing the NFC chip. So I don't have to go the time to go into the details, but I would also say that competition policy and competition authorities have been historically skeptical about regulatory vigilantism. If you take cases like Hilti and Tetra Pak, already at the time, the Commission decided, yes, safety is important, and security is important, but they are competition authorities to their authorities to enforce rules. And personally, as a citizen, I find more comfort in having public authorities enforcing privacy rules and security rules rather than private actors. I see that my time is up. What I would like to say to end is that I think going forward, one of the fundamental role of regulators will be to be in a position to distinguish between legitimate privacy and security claims and those that are pretextual or simply exaggerated. And that needs to be done on the basis of evidence and data. And this is why I'm so happy that this conference has been put together. I fear very much that gatekeepers will try to derail the DMA and the DMU regime by invoking excuses that are not legitimate. And I think that with the market study on mobile ecosystem, the CMA has taken the lead and set an important precedent for regulators across the world. I think regulators need to be equipped to be in a position to scrutinize and take evidence-based decision over the legitimacy and privacy and security legitimacy of privacy and security justifications.
Thank you, Damien. Just a quick follow-up. Very easy to call for the public sector, the regulators, to do the regulating. Do you have any views on which regulators and how? Because that's quite a challenge given the technical expertise in the companies themselves.
Well, I think, once again, the CMA and the ICO have shown that they're capable to deal with these issues, especially, and I really like your point, John, because they collaborate together. I think, this sort of collaboration between the different regulators active in the digital space is the way to go. We heard also from the first panel today that it made sense for competition authorities to share resources and share processes because, of course, you can only have so many data scientists, and you will have always fewer data scientists than those of the gatekeepers. So I think there's a lot of expertise that need to be built, but I think that is definitely possible, and I'm very encouraged by the steps that have been taken by some authorities, in particular the CMA, but also the French competition authorities, and I think others will follow. In the meantime, probably sharing and collaborating within states, and that is true for the UK, that is true in France, is definitely a way to go. So I'm actually quite optimistic, and maybe I'm unique in that way in believing that regulators are capable to do the job. I'm very much hostile to the view that regulators are incapable and it's better to leave it in the market because these people don't know what they're talking about. I don't think it's true. But you need capacity building.
Thank you. And now I think I'm going to give Jane the opportunity to respond to some of that, but also a particular question that's come in that I think is relevant to this discussion. I'm going to read it out, it's quite long. Some developments that purport to improve privacy may in fact weaken it, either by undermining cybersecurity or driving centralization of internet infrastructure. For example, the drive for end-to-end encryption can lead to applications that bypass enterprise and consumer security software, and developments like Apple's private relay service could hand control of a significant percentage of internet traffic to one dominant market participant. So, Jane, I'll let you respond first, and then maybe others want to pick up on that question as well.
So, first, to address private relay, we don't collect any data. The whole point of private relay is so no one gets access to the IP address. So that is just patently false, that it's handing any power to us. Actually, what we're doing is we're empowering the user to protect themselves from tracking, particularly when they're on guest Wi-Fi networks. And with respect to the CMA report, we're looking at it. There are a number of things that we disagree, and we are very, very happy to continue to engage with the CMA. I'm 100% focused on privacy. I feel like I know privacy at Apple like I know my own home. I've been doing it for 11 years, and I've been involved in most of the development of every product that touches personal data. So we would be very happy to engage with you and with John to talk about the controls that are in place, the benefits of the App Store, and a lot of that.
Thank you. John.
Diane, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Damien. I think it was very provocative, and I think that we need that provocation. And the ICO hasn't formed an official position on this. So I could be going out on a limb here, and I sense people cringing behind their browsers at home. We, in an ideal world, maybe what you propose would be good, but we don't have the capacity for ex-ante examination, I think, of every technology which is released or every app which is released. And so to that extent, if Apple is prepared to perform a kind of screening function, or at least a filtering function to keep out the bad actors, and as long as those settings are at a generally accepted point of compliance, I think that is a service. Jane, is it a public figure, how many apps are available through the App Store?
I think we just released a report on the amount of malware and fraud we have kept off the platform through app review. And, I would just, to add to that, I think we need to be accountable for the decisions that we make, absolutely accountable for any allegations of self-dealing. But I think the idea that by opening up the platform, that's going to be the cure-all to everything, I really think, and I'll defer to Jonathan to talk a little bit about some of the security concerns that was listed in, I think, your number 5.
I would have to go back and look.
But if I may, I'm not suggesting that regulators should examine everything ex ante. That's not what I said, not at all. What I'm saying is that, let me give you an example. I think Jane mentioned the ATT framework. It's a significant shift, right? Like the privacy sandbox in the case of Google. And it has significant consequences. So in those cases, I think, and the CMA did it with the privacy sandbox in a swift manner, and effective one, I would tend to believe. I think it's important for regulators to have a look, right? Because these sort of decisions can really interfere with competition and can actually mean that some companies may be wiped out. Right? If there are some companies that people would be pleased to see wiped out. I'm not mentioning one, but at the same time, when some decisions are consequential, I think that going to the regulator and asking the regulator to look into it, and if you don't do it, others will ask the regulator to do it, is meaningful. So what I'm saying is that I think we all agree that privacy and security are important. The point I'm raising is that the ideal solution is to find a way to ensure both privacy and security and competition. And most of the times, I tend to believe that it's possible. In fact, there may be scenarios where more competition can trigger more security and more, more privacy, because when you compete, that can become a factor of competition, and then can also, stimulate innovation. The only thing I'm skeptical about is that, it's privacy, it's security. No, we should not allow, we should not permit, we should not look into this. That's bad. The world as we know it will collapse. I don't believe it's the case, and I think that those competition authorities which have looked into the matter tend to agree. Now, to the extent you step in as a regulator, it has to be done on an objective basis with the proper evidence and the proper expertise.
Now, are we in danger of agreeing vigorously? The Mobile Ecosystems final report called for a three-way dialogue with the companies and the CMA and the ICO. Are we all agreeing, does the panel agree that this kind of voluntary cooperative model is the way to go, or are we still disagreeing about that?
Absolutely. And just to go back to ATT, the CNIL actually issued a finding with respect to ATT and how the CNIL is the French data protection regulator, and how it was consistent with GDPR and it protected consumers and gave consumers the ability to make choices about tracking.
Jonathan wants to come in.
Would it be helpful, perhaps, if I gave a little bit of a technical sketch of some of the concepts we've been kicking around here?
It really would.
Okay, so let me try to zip through the specific topics that have come up. With respect to the question about private relay and Jane's observation that Apple doesn't possess IP addresses, private relay works by directing certain network traffic to servers that are controlled not only by Apple. So it bounces your traffic through servers, some of which are controlled by Apple, some of which are not controlled by Apple. And as a result, there is no entity that is in a position to associate your network activity with your identity. For those who are familiar with Tor, it's an open source offering that does something similar. This is sort of like Apple's version of Tor. I don't know if that's in your marketing materials, but okay. So that's why.
No.
Gee, I wonder why. Okay, so that's why Apple's not in a position to take commercial advantage of that data. With respect to the question about end-to-end encryption or encryption in general and security scanning at the network level, there's an argument I saw quite often when I was at the FCC in the United States. Not coincidentally, it tended to come from internet service providers who were really interested in scanning customer network data for advertising purposes. From a technical perspective, it is, I'm not sure if I'm getting the local terminology right, poppycock. The sort of technically right way to do security scanning, if you have a user device you're really concerned about, is to use the wide range of off-the-shelf available tools that can reside on the device and monitor for security issues. Tons and tons of services in this space. You'll get way better perspective than you ever would just watching at the network level. That particular argument, at least to my technical analysis, does not hold water. On the issue of sideloading apps or alternative app stores and security, here I will respectfully part ways with Jane. There are some technical options for Apple to keep a sort of hand on that market while allowing folks to distribute outside of the App Store. They do something similar on Mac OS. Obviously, the platforms are not analogous, but the rough idea is you could have an app that gets scanned by Apple but isn't distributed by Apple, or is otherwise reviewed by Apple but again not distributed by Apple. Okay, and then last on the issue of end-to-end encryption and competition through interoperability, I just wanted to note that there are a bunch of different policy proposals out there, and how concerning they are for end-to-end encryption really depends on the proposal. If you're talking about sort of fully open sourcing every aspect of a protocol, and then everything has to be able to plug into that, that's a massive burden. It's going to lock in some protocols that sometimes have not made the best decisions over time. That's really problematic. On the other hand, if you say something like, Apple has to release a software development kit for interoperating with with iMessage, and they don't have to tell us exactly how it works. Just if you call the right API, you send an iMessage message, and they update the kit periodically. You have to stay up to date. That is a very different proposal, and could potentially be a tremendous win for consumers. In fact, one of the most insecure messaging systems out there is also one of the most popular messaging systems out there, text messaging. Horribly insecure. If everyone were using iMessage, I'm going to say something nice about Apple now. If everyone were using iMessage, that would be a huge win for security. And so competition may actually advantage security in that respect. I've blathered on a lot, so I'm going to stop.
This is exactly why we have technologists in the room. We had Derek McCauley on the Furman panel. He used slightly stronger language than poppycock, I have to say.
Sure. Okay. On your question, Diane, about the collaborative approach, collaboration is always good. But we shouldn't be naive, right? Okay, so you've got the DMA, you've got the DMU regime, there will be some market investigations. It will not go smoothly. I've been very much involved in the DMA debates. I spend a lot of my time, thinking, writing about it, and supporting it. And I've seen studies commissioned by gatekeepers that were truly mind-boggling. And I think some economists have lost their reputation in producing these studies. I think also that the DMA will trigger litigation. Designation will trigger litigation. The DMU regime, tons of litigation. So I like the idea of collaborative, I'm looking forward to work with you, let's meet later to discuss. Sure, very nice, but in practice, this will be a brutal battle. I'm betting on it. And yeah, if things can be done in a nice and smooth manner, I love it. But my prediction, and there will be another conference in 2 years, and in the meantime, other events, is that this will be very, very challenging. If you look at the rules in the DMA about the App Store, each and every of them will be challenged. There will be resistance to implement. And I think it's legitimate in a way to, if you disagree with a regulation, to challenge it and to, push your viewpoint. At the same time, I think there comes a moment where you need to implement, and we're not there yet.
Diane, can I just have my 2 cents? Thanks. I think collaboration is really important. I think regulators need to understand the markets that they are regulating, and that involves a dialogue and a discussion. It sometimes involves getting quite close to an understanding. And we've launched, for example, at the ICO, the regulatory sandbox. So we can actually explore the regulatory implications of an innovative application. We've done this in collaboration with the CMA, for example. And with the CMA, we've put out a joint statement on AdTech, for example. But I don't think that happens at the cost of more interventionist regulation, because we always retain the regulatory tools to examine an initiative ex post and to bring the sort of regulatory tools, the fines and the enforcement notices and the like, if we find on that ex post analysis that they are breaching those rules. So those things operate in tension, but I think we can be very effective working upstream and helping organisations to ensure they understand their obligations and are meeting them, but also downstream, identifying non-compliant behaviour and punishing it and sending signals out into the wider economy.
John, can I ask you the obverse of the question I put to Jonathan, which is about how should the regulators be using academic tools of this kind or working with academics?
Well, I think academics have an enormous amount to contribute in this area. They are, I'm trying to think, disinterested, not uninterested, isn't it? Disinterested observers and sources of expert and contestable technical input, and we really need that. And the other great advantage, of course, is that they don't cost very much. And we have some of these skills.
Fees have just gone up at this end of the panel.
It's an enormously competitive market for some of these skills, and it's difficult to retain that capacity within a regulatory framework. We have, I think, 80 in our tech team, but there are very specific skills that. It's important that we access from academia and that we're keeping across the kind of literature that people like Jonathan are producing.
There's another question come in specifically for you, John. With the CMA stepping up its focus on these technological skills, do you see the role of the ICO changing at all?
Yes, I do. I think that we need to be more agile and responsive to these very fast developing industries. And I'm not sure, and I think the previous panel touched on this point, that when you come to analyse the economic parameters of a particular market, you're already 10 years behind in your modelling. And I think we have the same risk in the world of data protection. So I think that we need to be able to stand up multidisciplinary teams, dispatch them, identify any challenges to the regulation, drive some regulatory stakes into the ground to give certainty to other market participants. But we need to be able to act on that far more quickly than we've been able to. I'm not just talking about in the UK, but internationally, we need to be able to do that with more fleet of foot and greater agility.
If I could follow up on that very briefly, and the prior question about sort of discussion-based approaches to these issues. I lost several years of my life to a standards process that was attempting a discussions-based approach to addressing web privacy through an organization called W3C. It was trying to set standards for this thing called Do Not Track that keeps coming back with different names. At any rate, I think it's important to understand when regulators choose a discussion strategy and an engagement strategy that the process of the discussion and engagement can itself advantage certain companies and disadvantage others. It was very clearly a strategy in the W3C process for advertising firms to drag it out as long as possible. And I think there's some evidence of that in engaging with competition and privacy regulators more recently. An example of that, just to put another company on the hot seat, is I think the interactions over Google's privacy sandbox are a little head-scratching from a technical perspective. The notion that it is desirable that the major the most popular web browser in the world retain allowing tracking by default as the status quo while we figure out what we want to do with web tracking is a little puzzling when every other major web browser disables tracking to some extent by default. And so I just want to really highlight that that is a dimension of negotiating with regulators that is important to keep in mind.
We've only got a few minutes left. I'd like to ask each panel member to address an issue that we haven't talked about so far, and it's the other party in the room, and that's the consumers. And I think Tim Wu raised this in his contribution, but we're talking about choice architecture, privacy, where people might have very strong feelings or different feelings about it. So I think the question on which you might end, and anything else you want to end with, is how do we take account, actually, of what consumers want in this domain and how best to protect them, when, as we've heard, it's actually very technical and complicated and difficult. So I'm going to go in reverse order. That means I'm picking on you first, Damien.
Yeah, so I think that if you think about consumers, it's sometimes difficult indeed to see what consumers want, right? So take the issue of privacy. I'm sure that if you ask people whether they care about privacy, they will say, we do care about privacy, although their behavior suggests the opposite, right, in many ways. So if you take, for example, the title of this panel, Privacy First, I would tend to see, yes, privacy absolutely, and security absolutely, but there are other things as well, right? I want a web which is private, but which is diverse with a lot of content. However it is actually funded. I want a web that is competitive. So, for example, there is this idea now that production of content with an advertising business model is absolutely terrible, right? And any sort of data, tracking or sharing is an absolute nightmare. Well, I'm definitely not pitching for Google. Those who know me, I've got several complaints and cases against them. It seems to me that it's slightly excessive, right? I mean, we cannot all shift to a subscription business model, right? A lot of the content on the internet is funded through advertising. And of course, if I want to have, so don't worry about my glasses, if you want to have, if I want to buy if I want to buy 10 subscriptions, for me and my children, I can. I've got the money to do that. But most people can only buy one, if at all, right? So I think that we need to think a little bit more broadly rather than focusing only on competition, only on privacy. I think consumers want different things, and we should try to combine them and find a balance between these different priorities.
Jonathan.
You've touched on exactly the hard science question here. How do you combine what folks say they want in interviews and surveys with what they actually do, behavioral data? Now, I would rather significantly take issue with the suggestion that what consumers do with respect to privacy is indicative of what their preferences are. There's, in fact, a wealth of academic research about that very issue. It's sometimes dubbed the privacy paradox. Why do people say they care so much about privacy but then don't act like they care about privacy? Well, it turns out, you shouldn't need a PhD in computer science to understand how to configure your social media settings. And to give an example of this, actually, from Apple's...
A brief example, because we're running over time.
It did. Okay, very quick example. App tracking transparency. I'm going to say something that is nice but maybe backhanded. Is not actually technical innovation. What was new about app tracking transparency was flipping a default and presenting the user with a pop-up. right? It was a change to the choice architecture, and it radically changed how privacy works in iOS, right? So that has nothing to do with user preferences and everything to do with choice. So I'll close by saying I have a PhD student who is doing wonderful work looking at user behavior and preferences with respect to competition issues, and if you're watching, good luck with your dissertation.
Jane.
And I will quickly say my remarks that I gave earlier, I hope you took away that everything that we do is focused on the consumer. And as Jonathan said, ATT, and as I explained, was an evolution. And it was an evolution that was a change in advertising practices on the platform in response to consumers. We get consumer questions, complaints every day, and we are focused clearly on our users and consumer trust, because if they don't trust us, they won't use our platform.
And John, you get the final word.
Thank you. Well, I don't think that people are saying that they want one thing or the other. Sure, people want free stuff. People need to understand that comes at a cost. The free stuff they want is funded by advertising. But as Jonathan alluded to, so much of the so-called choice and transparency is driven by dark patterns that favour the revenue gatherer. And what we need to move towards is a more transparent and effective choice mechanism, which we do not have. Transparency without an effective ability to make choices isn't worth anything. I looked at the New Yorker website, uses the TCF framework. There was about 450 vendors. That's transparency, but it's useless transparency to me. I can do nothing with that information. So where we need to be moving, I think, is to really be making, giving people the tools to make effective choices and exercise control over their data while getting the benefits of the innovations that the digital industries produce.
This debate's going to run and run. You've been a fantastic panel. Thank you very much. Please everybody join me in thanking them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That really was a magnificent panel. Very articulate and thoughtful panelists, a magnificent chair. We've now got a break online. You'll see when we're coming back. It's around 20 minutes or so. So cue to a coffee break.